Alright guys, welcome to another video. Today I'm going to be discussing why classic WoW and TBC dungeons are simply the best, in my humble opinion. At the end of the day guys, shouldn't be taking this video too seriously. I'm just some nerd on the internet saying some opinions, don't take it to heart. I'm just having a little bit of fun, a little bit of a calm, chilled out discussion about why classic WoW and TBC dungeons are just so good. Anyway guys, just before we jump in, I'd really appreciate if people did actually subscribe to my channel. Apparently only 7.6% of people who watch my videos actually subscribe, which is massively below the YouTube average. I've seen people with that number up to 30%, so please give me a quick subscribe and hit that notification bell because that really does help me out. So I do genuinely think that dungeon design has started to decline at round about Wrath of the Lich King time, pretty much from on then. Although now and again there is an absolute gem dungeon released in like a particular expansion. Can't think of any on top of my head right now. But I'm not saying like old dungeons are drastically really bad in every single expansion since the Burning Crusade, because again there are those absolute gems out there. But I think their overall philosophy and design has massively changed, and I think that has had a largely a negative effect on how dungeons come across and how their gameplay is essentially experienced. This video will have 4 main points, and the first point is the size. So you've got to think of dungeons like Blackrock Depths, Strathholm, Scholomance, the Shattered Halls, Shadow Labyrinth, and Steam Vaults and stuff like this. All of these dungeons are pretty big, which means it takes you quite a while to actually complete them. Whereas I think in Wrath of the Lich King, all the dungeons roughly had the kind of same duration, and they were able to be completed fairly quickly. But when a dungeon is huge, like the Blackrock Depths, it no longer feels just like a dungeon, it feels essentially like its own zone. In essence, Blackrock Depths is an instant zone, and it's a real shame that something like the Blackrock Depths hasn't been recreated. When a dungeon is big, the dungeon itself feels more like a threat because there was more of a long, arduous journey in order for all the heroes to experience before they could actually get to the last boss itself. Whereas like in more, modern dungeons, in more recent expansions, the dungeons are so quick and they just flash by you, and it really feels like you were really in a dungeon. Because a dungeon crawl, if you go back to all the old kind of RPG games, some dungeons were intended to just last for ages. But if a dungeon is very fast and quick, it has the same amount of bosses every single time, it feels like more like you're playing an arcade game, because it is more systematic and there's more consistency between each and every dungeon. Because when dungeons release on retail new expansions, every single dungeon is roughly the same length and they're roughly the same amount of bosses, and they just feel like, it just feels like an arcade kind of styled dungeon. Whereas the dungeons in Classic and TBC, they're more unique, they're longer, they have different durations, different stuff going on. Another really cool thing about the dungeons in TBC and Classic is how there is a number of dungeons attached to the same kind of dungeon area. So what I mean by this is obviously Scarlet Monastery has Graveyard, Library, then Armory, then Cathedral. So what that kind of does is, say for instance you do Scarlet Monastery for the first time, you do Graveyard, that's the only dungeon you can do, you won't be able to do Library straight after because you won't be high enough level. Which means you would have to go out into the world again, level up a little bit more, before you can continue progressing through the dungeon. It makes the dungeon feel even longer because it's basically 4 dungeons in one, and you actually have to become more and more powerful to get to the different parts of that dungeon, which again makes the dungeon feel more like a threat. In essence, the dungeon is no longer a dungeon, it's a conquest, right? You have to conquer the Scarlet Monastery. In TBC they do it even better because there's Hellfire Rampart, then Blood Furnace, then Shattered Halls, and then there's a raid, Magfaridon's Lair, at the end of all those dungeons attached to the Hellfire Citadel. So the whole Hellfire Citadel, again, it feels like you go into war against the Hellfire Citadel, whereas like in retail, more recent expansions, there's dungeons scattered around the world, and they don't really, most of the time, they're not associated with one another. There are some exceptions to that rule, but most of the time the dungeons are like so separate and their own separate little mini threat, again like a mini little arcade threat, whereas in the TBC it's a massive big threat. You've got this entire Hellfire Citadel, you've got the entire Shadow Labyrinth out to get you. Another obvious example is Blackrock Mountain. So you got Blackrock Depths, you got Upper Blackrock Spire, Lower Blackrock Spire, Venom's Molten Core, and Blackwing Lair. So that's a huge amount of different instanced areas inside one zone. So that makes the whole threat of the Blackrock Mountain even bigger. Another great thing about the dungeons being so big is a lot of them are non-linear. Now this is mostly for Classic WoW dungeons. I can't think off the top of my head of any dungeon really in the Burning Crusade that isn't linear. It does largely feel like dungeons after the Burning Crusade do mostly become linear. You know, you have to defeat bosses 1 till 5 and that's it, job done. Whereas in Classic you have a number of different bosses, little mini bosses, and loads of different objectives for you to do. For instance, Blackrock Depths run, you can do, you know, lava runs, you can do arena runs, you can do emp runs, you can do loads of different runs to kill loads of different bosses in the entire area. Same thing with Stratholme, you can do live run or you can do an undead run, and yeah, stuff like that. Another thing that's worth mentioning is there's kind of special runs like the Dire Tribute run. If you do a dungeon in a particular unique creative way, which challenges the player a little bit more, then you get extra loot at the end and the objective slightly changes because you've got to avoid certain bosses along the way, which presents a new interesting and creative challenge for you to experience. Whereas dungeons largely in retail are just kind of, they don't have stuff like that. Last thing I want to touch on is the design and atmosphere of all the dungeons. In retail dungeons, what really annoys me about them is a lot of them are outside, and you can mount up and get through the entire dungeon on your mount, which kind of defeats the purpose and the point of a dungeon. The whole point of a dungeon is supposed to be inside a cave or a fortress or something like that. I feel like a lot of the dungeons in retail these days don't really feel like dungeons anymore. They feel more like scenarios, although that was an abandoned concept. But anyway, if you imagine Stratholme for an instance, you know, you're basically in a city which has been massively overrun by zombies, and you're slowly fighting your way through a city. And it feels like you're in the film 28 Days Later, just slowly fighting for survival. Another good example would be the Shattered Halls. You're basically in a military base and you're fighting an entire army. This is why in Shattered Halls there's loads of really big mob packs, some of them up to like 6 mobs for one mob pack. To really get that feeling that you are essentially in the Shattered Halls to fight an army all the way to that army's general. And then Blackrock Depths is no different to the Fellowship of the Ring fighting their way through the mines of Moria. For my final thoughts, I don't absolutely hate dungeons in more recent expansions, because at the end of the day, the mechanics of the dungeons have definitely drastically improved as time has gone on, to the point where they're actually difficulty. And then obviously you have Mythic mode dungeons now, which are really fun, really challenging, and then Mythic Plus, which make the dungeons continuously more challenging, to the point where some people just do, form guilds and form groups exclusively to do Mythic Plus dungeons now, rather than doing raiding, which is actually quite interesting. But it would be cool if in the Shadowlands they actually released a dungeon which, again, is a little bit like Blackrock Depths. It has over, I can't remember how many bosses it has. What is it, like 30 bosses in Blackrock Depths? It's immense. Like a dungeon where it's really big, there's loads of different choices of what bosses you can do. That would be pretty cool. Even if the bosses themselves are not like, don't have the best mechanics in the world, it would be cool to just make a really big instant zone like a Blackrock Depths for someone to experience. But even imagine if they released a lot less dungeons in Shadowlands, but then released like one huge dungeon with about 15 bosses and loads of, it would be totally non-linear. You can explore that dungeon however you want. You can do different segments of it, different runs of it, different bosses, and just kind of have an absolute free roam inside an entire zone to do whatever dungeons you want. That would be pretty cool in my opinion. And it is a shame that that kind of dungeon design has, long just kind of been forgotten in retail. I remember a while ago Tips Out made a video exclusively talking about Blackrock Depths, and he got basically broke the internet a little bit, because the Blackrock Depths is just so good. It is by far the best dungeon ever to release in World of Warcraft's history. I mean, let's be honest. And regardless of the fact that the boss mechanics are fairly basic and fairly simple, it's a lot of the time the actual mechanics of a boss isn't the most important thing. What is the most important thing is how that dungeon actually comes across and how it feels when you're inside it. But anyway guys, I've gibbered on long enough. My name is Goblin. To my next video. Ciao.